since the depths of slavery, our people have been culture creators. There is no American culture without African-American culture.
Any fool could see that so-called white people are not really white, and so-called black people are not really black.
Join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni-American Podcast.
Today's guest, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, is arguably the most prominent and influential Black American scholar in the United States. We have a wide-ranging discussion on his own intellectual development and trajectory, the history and culture of Black Americans and the African diaspora, and the many, many projects he's working on currently, as well as those over the years.
It really was a fascinating conversation with Professor Gates. And I think for the sake of our viewers and listeners, we would do well to point out one dimension of it, which is that Professor Gates mentioned that the name of our project, the Omni-American Future Project, is an homage to Albert Murray and his book, The Omni-Americans. Murray was a teacher of Gates and our teacher as well. But while Professor Gates has a distinctly American identity, like Albert Murray, he leaves room for a connection to Africa in a way that you really don't find in Murray. So this distinction and the conception of a robust American identity and how Africa fits in is part of this fascinating conversation, which I think our viewers and listeners will enjoy.
And now for Dr. Henry Louis Gates. Welcome to Straight Ahead, the Omni-American Podcast. We are extremely honored to have Professor Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. with us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Greg. It's my honor. I love the fact that the title of your show is an homage to Albert Murray. That's great.
Absolutely. And we'll be speaking, of course, about Albert Murray and others in our conversation. I'd also like to give Arya a chance to say some words to you.
Right. So thank you. I also just want to express my appreciation, Professor Gates, for your being on our program. I've read and admired your work for a number of years. I read your book on the Black Church. I've read on Zora Neale Hurston, the King of Cats, Albert Murray. So it's wonderful to have you with us here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
All right. Well, you are definitely eminently prepared to answer the following question. We'll start with the softball. Why would you say African-American studies is a crucial field of study in the American Academy in 2024?
Well, African-American studies is a crucial field of study in the American Academy because of the depth and range of the experiences of our people. Our contributions not only to American culture, but to world culture. And the astonishing fact that a people enslaved could transcend their enslavement in part by creating cultural forms that are universal. And I'm thinking of the following. Music, the way that we worship God and praise God. Translating the King James Version of the Hebrew Bible into the genre known as the spirituals, or what W.E.B. Du Bois famously called the sorrow songs. One of my favorite examples is from the book of Ezekiel 37, a sermon of the dry bones. So here two forms are born. One, a canonical sermon. The heel bone is connected to the ankle bone. I'm going to get my anatomy wrong, but that was my first anatomy lesson. I remember as a kid thinking, the toe bone, I'm looking at my toe, the toe bone's connected to the heel bone connected to the ankle bone, all the way up to the head bone.
Right.
And the other is, that's part of that verse is Ezekiel sees a wheel within a wheel. And Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel way in the middle of the air. Now, where did slaves get the inspiration to turn that verse, that chapter, into sermonic form and musical form? That's just one tiny example of the dual genius embedded in the church, forged by our African-American ancestors. And there are hundreds and hundreds of other examples. So Steal Away, my absolute favorite, Ride on, King Jesus, no man can hinder thee. Ride on, King Jesus, ride on, no man can. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. That's what I'm talking about.
That's right. That's right.
And the spirituals then morphed. That's the sacred parallel, and under that parallel is the secular. So if we look at them, as you know, my most recent series, which I'm very proud of, is on the history of gospel. What are the origins of gospel? Well, it's like a gumbo. You take the spirituals, you add blues, you add jazz, you stir it up, and you're in Chicago, 1921. Thomas A. Dorsey, formerly known as Georgia Tom, the blues man, has a religious conversion at the National Baptist Convention. He's a composer. He still uses the same blues and jazz forms, but changes the lyrics to worship God. And Greg, it got him kicked out of the church. They said, don't be got devil music in here. Don't be pretending that that's religious music. And you know what made the preachers change? When they saw the popularity among the congregation. Now, I don't want to get off point, but what I'm trying to say is that starting in at least the 1880s, different commentators said the only original composition to world civilization made by Americans was the quote unquote Negro melodies. And this was most famously stated by the Czech composer Antonín Dvořák, one of the most famous classical music composers in the world, came to New York and worked with the Black composer Harry Burleigh. And he gave an interview in the New York Herald Tribune in 1893, and he said just that. He said that all future classical music composed in America had to be based on what he called the Negro melodies, meaning the songs that the slaves had created. And he composed Symphony Number 9, also known as the New World Symphony, which was based on the Negro spirituals. So what I'm saying is that, and then, of course, every Black commentator, desperate, remember what was happening in America in 1893, the rise of Jim Crow white supremacy. When white racists were saying that Black people essentially were subhuman, stupid, ugly, dumb, and couldn't create culture. People like Victoria Earl Matthews and the great Black feminist W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk, they seized on Dvořák's authority to say, no, we are culture creators, we are culture bearers, just like everyone else. And that was important because Black people were in a battle over their status in the human community. In order to justify the reinstitution of slavery with the rise of Jim Crow in the 1890s, which was accompanied by disenfranchisement of Black male voters, because remember, only men could vote, and blatant terrorism, known as lynching, of course, and then eugenics and pseudo-scientific estimates of the status of the Negro, as we would have said then, as in the human community. Black people had to fight back. And one of the ways they fight back in what I call America's first social media campaign was to seize on any positive estimate of the culture that we had created. And the most sublime form was music. They said that nobody can doubt that we are great creators of musical forms, particularly in the spirituals. All of which is to say that since the depths of slavery, our people have been culture creators. And there is no American culture, as both Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray repeatedly said, there is no American culture without African American culture. And our contributions to history in the military, our people have served nobly since the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, and God knows 200,000 men served in the Civil War. You know, we've been the ultimate patriots in oratory. My goodness, what greater orators in the 19th century than Frederick Douglass and all the Black congressmen, the 16 Black congressmen appointed and elected to Congress under Reconstruction between 1870 and 1877, and then the great tradition of music, among many other cultural forms. And then the blues, jazz. America's classical music is jazz, without a doubt. And who created jazz? Our ancestors created jazz. And we showed how to take European forms as a basis and European instruments and do that gumbo thing and blackify them, put that African spice on them, and use those forms and instruments to express the inner essence of African American culture. So while we have been the ultimate Americans, one might say the Omni-Americans, we have also created a self-sustaining African American culture that, through call and response, through signifying, through riffing, has a long continuous tradition, both in music and in oratory and in literature, starting with Phillis Wheatley, of course, the poet, and especially in the genre known as the slave narratives, the most brilliant example of which is Frederick Douglass's 1845 and 1855 slave narrative. And then in the novel form as well, which by fits and starts will reach its most mature manifestations. James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of Ex-Colored Man in 1912, the novels of the Harlem Renaissance, particularly Nella Larson's Passing novels, and then 1937, Zora Neale Hurston's masterpiece, Their Eyes Were Watching God. 3 years later, Native Son, one of the great works of American naturalism.
By Richard Wright.
And then Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is, in my estimation, one of the greatest and most complex and fascinating novels written in any language at any time. And then you could skip on to Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and the great Black feminist novels as well. And Toni Morrison, of course, would be honored for her genius contributions with the Nobel Prize, as she certainly deserved. You know, in her canon, everyone, my colleagues in the field of African American literature, would probably vote for Beloved, and I admire Beloved. But as a formalist critic, like Ellison and Murray, I like her novel Jazz, because it's a tribute to Faulkner and Marquez and Virginia Woolf. It's a masterpiece of formalist experimentation. Anyway, as you can see, I am a professor of African American studies. And I love the tradition. Right. And the sad thing is, we didn't sit down and write novels merely to express our sense of being in the world, like, say, Proust or Victor Hugo or Virginia Woolf. We also wrote novels, for example, to show that we were full and equal members of the human community. And that's a horrible burden to put on an author, to say that your writing has to show that your people really are as intelligent as, quote unquote, we are. But that's the burden of representation that every Black writer has had to face. That's the cross that we had to bear. because of the structures of white supremacy and anti-Black racism.
Well, thank you. I'm going to pass it along to Arye because he has a question, I think, about one of the figures that you mentioned.
Yeah, we can definitely segue into Zora Neale Hurston here, but that was such a rich presentation.
Yes.
And I think that the key word that I heard was tradition, tradition meaning a transmission. And I think it bottomed together beneath the burden of representation, a transmission of a sense of life. And as an American tradition, I grew up as an American who joyfully received that sense of life. And I think it's particularly striking in the case of Zora Neale Hurston. You wrote an introduction together with Genevieve West to her essays, You Don't Know Us Negroes. And in there's this powerful sentence which really resonated with my understanding of the Jewish tradition, which is that oppression strengthened our inner life, to paraphrase. It didn't destroy our inner life. It strengthened our inner life. And that's just such a remarkable view of one's suffering, to be able to transmute that into strength. I was wondering if perhaps you could unpack that a little bit and unpack how you understood her strong vision of human life and her tremendous self-possession.
Well, in the face of oppression, what does the people do? I mean, you only have two choices. You fold and capitulate, or you fight back.
There you go.
It was the church really that sustained the Black community in its worst times. The church was, I realized when I made the documentary on the Black church and wrote the book, and thank you for your kind words about that the church was a cultural, spiritual, and political laboratory. I learned, I gave my first oratorical presentation when I was about 3 or 4 years old at Easter time. Now, every Easter, every kid in the church had to deliver what we called a piece, P-I-E-C-E. And the littlest kid went first. And I was the littlest kid, little Skippy Gates. And mine was, Jesus was a boy like me, and like him, I want to be. And man, I memorized that thing. I was reciting it. I had it down. And at Easter, you got new clothes. That was one of the great things. I loved Easter. Christmas was great because you got all these toys. But Easter, you got the style. And my mother was a seamstress. She loved clothes. So I can't help it, from the time I was a kid. So I had a new gray suit on, had a little pork pie hat on my big head. So I'm going to church and I'm dancing. I'm saying, Jesus was a boy like me. I'm like him. And all the kids said, would you shut up? That's the point. And when the minister, and this was the Walden Methodist Church in Piedmont, West Virginia, population 2,500, an Irish-Italian paper mill town with just over 300 Black people. Now, that church maybe seats 100 people. I don't know. But you know what? When he called my name and I stood there at the altar in front of the church, I felt like I was in front of a microphone in Yankee Stadium, man. It seemed like 10,000 people were there. And I completely forgot every word. I couldn't even remember my name. I just stood there. And the people started to giggle and they started to laugh a little bit. And I got more and more ashamed. And then finally in the back of the church, I heard a voice and everybody turned. And it was my mother who stood up and said, Jesus was a boy like him, and like him, he wants to be. And everybody clapped and I bowed. I took the bow and I sat down. And I'm just saying that it was where, we learned communal rituals. Like that was a very healing, accepting ritual. You learned how to speak. You learned how to memorize. I, of course, was part of the choir as I grew up. You listen to different patterns of sermons. You could be the lowliest member of the working class 6 days a week. You could be a maid, a janitor, a butler, a chauffeur. Nothing wrong with those professions. I'm not trying to say that. You could be in one of the worst working positions at the paper mill where everybody in our town worked. But on Sunday, you were Miss Smith or Miss Jones, or you were Mr. Thomas or Mr. Smith. You were the chair of the deacon board. You know, you had to learn to organize the finances of a church. You had to hire and fire a minister. You then also, in addition to all the business aspects of running a church, there were all the artistic aspects which kept the congregation in their seats, meaning great singing, great preaching, great religious programs. And you had to figure out how to keep the building up, how to expand it, how to develop a missionary fund. So we were always sending money abroad for, African people. I'm just saying that every aspect of being a human being or being a citizen in the American Republic, which was denied 6 days a week,
right,
was fulfilled and maintained on the seventh day in the form of the church. Its functions were multiple, ranging from belief in God to being a businessman or a businesswoman or an organizational genius, a recruiter to get people into the church, and dealing with the inevitable questions of what is the nature of being, of a human being, over their 70, as the Bible says. What happens when you die? How do you bring the pain that you're suffering during the week, whether it's in a personal relationship or with an illness, a medical condition? How do you bring that to God for it and to religion for its salvific, if that's the right word, function? How do you gain comfort from God in through prayer and through communal worship? So the church, when I interviewed Oprah, she said, in a sentence, the church was everything. And the church was everything for us. It was the basis for tradition. And when you look at subsequent musical or written forms, they all had their basis in the church. Zora Neale Hurston, which she wrote Moses, Man of the Mountain, and about Moses, and her 1934 book, Jonah's Gourdvine, is about a Black preacher. And look at Motown. All of those singers started in the church. And I could go on and give you 1,001 other examples. But we took the white man's Christianity. Malcolm X used to say, how could you take the white man's Christianity? But we took it and flipped it and made it our own. We created a Black form of Christianity, an African-American form of Christianity, which exists today. As Greg knows, I spend about 2 months every year on the island of Martha's Vineyard. And Oak Bluffs, one of the towns there, has a long tradition of the African-American presence. And every Sunday at Union Chapel, man, it's packed. Church starts at 10. You need to get there by 9:15 to get a parking place and a seat. And it's full of very successful African-Americans. And I could give names of people that everyone would know, members of the National Artistic class or the Wall Street class, the intellectual class. Many of these people probably don't even believe in God. And often I sit there and I reflect on why they're there, why I'm there. They're there to see the celebration of the cultural forms. They bring each Sunday, it's like an all-time greatest hits Black preacher, right? So you have Calvin Butts, who's passed on now, or you have Otis Moss Jr., the great minister from Cleveland, or his son, Otis Moss the third, who often rounds it out. And then I can give you the names of other preachers. And, people stand up like they're getting the Holy Ghost, and they clap and they laugh at the sermons, and the preachers are all in their best forms. And then afterwards, people go to, buffet, often at Lola's, which has fried chicken and grits, keeping up the tradition. And you can hear people say, I give him a 95, like Dick Clark. Said he had a good beat, but you can't dance to it,
But Professor Gates,
Yes.
if I may interrupt.
Okay.
There's no disagreement with what you're saying. But in Albert Murray terms, from Stompin' the Blues, you're talking about the Sunday morning church service. So that was crucial, essential. But there was also the Saturday night function.
That's right.
So
And
let's go ahead.
You can't have, they're like a Janus face, the twin faces from which we inherited from the Greeks of, comedy and tragedy, or in the Yoruba tradition, Eshu, the messenger of the gods, has two faces, two heads. One looks to the future, one looks to the past. He's the patron saint of African-American critics like Ralph Ellison, or like Zora Neale Hurston, or like Albert Murray, or like me.
Right.
And you can't have Sunday morning without Saturday night. The example I gave of Thomas A. Dorsey, a.k.a. Georgia Tom, before 1921, and then Thomas A. Dorsey, the father of Black gospel. They're just flip sides of the same forms, the same music. It had the same structures. It just had different content. And you had to have Saturday night in order to have the secular relief, the pure joy of secular expression. And you did that all night. Then you went to Sunday and asked for forgiveness for what you did Saturday night. And that's what a whole culture is composed of, the secular and the sacred. And that those two faces, as it were, compose the whole of the circle of African-American culture. So that Rick Powell, the great art historian at Duke, wrote a book about the blues tradition. And essentially, he sees the blues as the foundation of all of African-American culture. Du Bois saw the spirituals as the foundation of all African-American culture. You put them together, you have Saturday night and Sunday morning, and I prefer that kind of interpretation.
And Sterling Stuckey in slave culture thought that the ring shout was a foundational form that the sacred and the secular expressed through.
It was. Identifying parts of the whole is interesting, but you have to concentrate on the whole. There was the ring shout, which was movement of the feet, not lifting them off the ground, because if you didn't lift your feet off the ground, if you lifted your feet off the ground, you were doing the devil dance, devil music. But if you kept your feet on the ground and shuffled, you were still within the realm of the sacred. I don't know who came up with that arbitrary definition, but it is kind of fascinating. But while they were doing that, they were also crying, they were weeping, they were singing. There would be a leader who would be keeping time, keeping music, and no doubt a leader who would be doing a riff on a verse of the Bible. In other words, creating a sermon. So the ring shout on its own is not enough to say that it was the basis of African-American culture. In my opinion, it was one of the key factors in a larger sacred ensemble of artistic manifestations. Let's put it that way. It was one form among many. And so I would agree with him, but it wasn't the only one. And who knows? You can't go back. Everyone has an origin story, right? And Sterling's is based on the ring shout. Oh, that's fine. Rick's is based on the blues. That's fine. I like to put them all together,
Okay. Yeah. So we've mentioned Albert Murray. You wrote the forward or intro to the 50th anniversary edition. And he wrote in that book, as you know, that any fool could see that so-called white people are not really white and so-called black people are not really black. So I think it's fair to say that both Ralph Ellison and Murray, they were intellectual and cultural partners. They emphasized culture over race.
Mm-hmm.
If you agree with that, why would you think that was the case?
Well, the great Freud's greatest disciple, his greatest student was Carl Jung, Jung for our audience. And Carl Jung came to the United States in the 1920s. And he wrote an essay, which I teach, actually. And he has a line, which I don't think that Ralph Ellison or Al ever read that essay. And in it, he says, the most surprising thing that he discovered in the United States was not how white people were, but how black they were. And he said, the Negro is in your homes, in your lives, in your the most intimate aspects of your being are infiltrated by the Negro, and that the presence of the Negro, and I'm paraphrasing, has bent and shaped and colored white America so that white and black are inextricably intertwined. And Greg, who does that sound like? It sounds like Ralph, and it sounds like Al. And Carl Jung said that in the late 20s and early 1930s. And it's true. When sometimes I close my eyes when I'm hearing an interview from a white American from the South, and I can't tell if they're white or black, and when you talk about food, white people in the South and black, they eat the same food, they talk the same talk, they have the same rhythms and mannerisms. There's just no question about it. That we mutually constitute each other. And that's true not only in the South. The reason the South is the obvious example is that until 1910, 90% of all African Americans lived in the states that composed the former Confederacy. And then the Great Migration changed all that until 1970, when black people started moving back to the South. But it's true in our language. I once read a letter to the editor of the New York Times, and it was about the existence of a slang word. And I wish I could remember what the word was, but the person was arguing that the slang word had been coined in California. And the slang word was coined in the underground of New York City, in Harlem, And, it was a word like hip, something really obvious that any linguist would know is rooted in the African-American vernacular. By the way, along with about 10 other scholars, I'm editing the Oxford Dictionary of African-American English and historical principles, tracing the etymology of all the words that Black people have contributed to the American language, as we might say.
The vernacular.
The vernacular. And we can do that with any cultural form. That's true of music. It's true of oratory. It's true of how we walk. It's true of how we dance. It's true of how we talk, how we think, how we, as it were, be in the world, the state of being. What if an objective observer defined the elements of American culture? A lot of those elements would be rooted in the African experience that came on the boats in the dreaded slave trade, and then was brewed and boiled and cooked in the slave cabins, and then came north with the Great Migration. There is no Black American culture without white American culture. There is no white American culture without Black American culture. Every Black person who's been to Africa realizes how American they are as soon as they get out of the airport. One of the things, I've been to over 20 African countries. I've made 1, 2, 3 documentaries for the BBC and PBS about ancient African culture. I vacationed in Africa. I have many African friends. The only reason that I am here doing this interview is because of the intellectual influence of 2 Africans, Wole Soyinka, the great Nigerian playwright who got the first Black person to get the Nobel Prize in 1986, who was my mentor at the University of Cambridge. And my other best friend, Kwame Anthony Appiah, the great philosopher at NYU who writes the ethicist column every week for the Sunday Times magazine. They sat me down, Greg. I was pre-med. In my generation, you guys, all smart little colored boys and colored girls were raised to be medical doctors. That's true of my Jewish friends as well. They tell me that.
Or lawyers. Is lawyer or doctor, right?
Yeah, if you can't get in med school, that's okay. You can get into law school. And my brother, Paul, is an oral surgeon. He's 5 years older than I am. And I got cousins who, we had 3 generations of dentists in our extended Gates family. I got cousins who are doctors, out the wazoo. They sat me down, man, in October 1973, and they said, after they got me loaded on wine, my generation at Yale, where I was an undergrad, we didn't drink wine, right? People got, let's just say they got inebriated in more vaporous forms. Soyinka is an enophile. He's one of the great experts on wine. He taught me everything I know about wine. So they took me to an Indian restaurant. And Soyinka brings his own chili sauce. He calls it engine oil. And my mouth is on fire, Greg. And I'm drinking this wine. I'm totally loaded, as we say. And he slaps his hand on the table and says, "We brought you here for a reason. We're here from the future. We're here from your future. And you're not going to be a doctor, you idiot. You're put on earth to be a professor of African and African-American literature." And you know what? I actually cried. Now, I cried because my mouth was on fire. But I cried because they had identified something that I deeply felt and wanted. That was to be a scholar, and a scholar of the African-American and African tradition. But I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know how to get out of this preparation that I had been grounded in. I'd been propagandized to be a doctor, right? And I used to be able to, you take the front page of the New York Times, I could see the word Negro at a glance on the front page of any newspaper. Though I didn't major in African or African-American studies, I tried to take 1 course per semester at Yale. And I got, I love those courses. And, whether it's African-American literature, the Harlem Renaissance, or Introduction to Jazz. And I just, I could memorize everything. I could own it, as we say. And then I expanded into studying African art. And when I was 19, I took a gap year at the end of my sophomore year. Yale had this fabulous program funded by the Carnegie Corporation called 5-year BA. And it was called 5-year BA because you took a year off and didn't get any credit. And you had to go to what we used to call the third world. And because since the age of 10, I was obsessed with Africa. And I was 10 years old in 1960, and that's when I think 19 African nations became independent. And guys, I even memorized the names of the leaders, the presidents or prime ministers of those countries, and the names of the capital. I remember the Congo, Kinshasa, Patrice Lumumba, Moise Chambe. However Walter Cronkite said them, I said them. And so when I was 19, Afro, man, I had a big Afro. I went to work in an Anglican mission hospital in the middle of Tanzania. I took Swahili lessons, Unasema Kiswahili, and I lived in the bush with these Australian missionaries serving the Manyoni district in the poorest area in Tanzania, which is one of the poorest countries in Africa. And then with a white guy named, now a priest named Lawrence Biddle Weeks, we hitchhiked across the African continent from Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean all the way to Kinshasa, the capital of Congo, which is, I think, about 200 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. So and then I flew to Nigeria and to Ghana, ended up making a pilgrimage at the age of 20 to Du Bois's grave, W.E. Du Bois, my hero, right? So I have a lot of experience with African cultures from the time I was 19 years old. And I can't speak for every African American who goes to Africa, but I can speak for myself. And you realize two things. You realize that, yes, we are an African people. There's no doubt about that. But you realize that we are not an African people as well. You realize that we are an American African people, that our Africanity, to coin a not too beautiful word, has been molded within the context of white American culture. So that we are mulatto culture. We are bifurcated. We are black and we are white. And guys, you know that my work with DNA through my series I love, Finding Your Roots on PBS, right. We have never tested an African American. Not one. Think about the most African, or what we used to call Negroid African American who comes to mind. We have never tested one African American who was 100% sub-Saharan African, genetically. Right. Every African American virtually has white blood, to put it in the vernacular. Think about that. That's a metaphor. That's at the level of science, which no one can refute. But that is a metaphor for both American culture and African American culture. And I think the best estimate is that 4% of the white American population would be defined as black in 1895 under the law of hypodescent, or the one drop rule. Right. And there is no white American culture without black people. And there is no black American culture without white people. James Baldwin, in one of my favorite essays called Here Be Dragons, put it brilliantly. He said at the end, many of my countrymen, he talks about the blend of white and black, male and female, female and male, black and white, white and black. And he said, many of my countrymen find this fact exceedingly unfair. And so very often do I. And then he concludes, but none of us can do anything about it. It goes like this. Each of us helplessly and forever contains the other. Male and female, female and male, white and black, black and white. Many of my countrymen find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair, and so very often do I. But none of us, Baldwin concludes, can do anything about it. That could be the epigraph. I could have used that for my introduction to Albert Murray. Now, let's go back to the Omni-Americans. I read that sophomore year at Yale. And you know what struck me? His definition of the social science fiction monster. And you know about that. That is one of the most original contributions to American cultural theory and to American sociology. When he said that the sociologists had created this fiction of a pathological Negro, a pathological Black American. That all we were was the sum total of our pathology, which is ridiculous.
Can I ask a question on that point? So if we're looking to the future, you have this tradition which transmits a sense of life, and it's a sense of life which is heroic and joyful and receptive.
In the face of despair. In the face of despair.
Yeah, and it's precisely the capacity, the deep vision of antagonistic cooperation that can transform any challenge into strength, which it's a beautiful feedback mechanism by which the struggle grows stronger. And that's part of the American heritage. It belongs to all Americans if they will see themselves as belonging to this tradition, because we're talking about human realities. But today, that social science fiction that you're describing has become very, very pervasive, as you know, in the academy, in popular culture, in the form of DEI, in the form of other social theories that really require at the get-go that we see Black people as victims, as some kind of having a deformed psychology that Albert Murray couldn't stand. But that seems to be the premise of so much of today's popular discourse. Moving forward, how do you see the reposition, the bequeathing of this tradition to America in the face of these other voices?
Well, I think that we're in the midst of a culture war. But the first culture war was in the 1890s, of course, with the imposition of Jim Crow and with the proliferation because of developments in technology like making chromolithography affordable. The reason that's important is that racists could then depict Black people in living color in 4 colors as Sambos, as chicken thieves, as with big lips, and the embodiment of deracination, as stupid, as liars, as ugly. And Black people fought back with the trope of the new Negro, a new Negro who was not like all these stereotypes. Martha Patterson, another scholar, and I are publishing this huge anthology with Princeton University Press next year on a history of this trope of the new Negro going back to 1877. So there was a social media war then, a cultural war. And the one that I played a part in was in the 1990s. And it took a form which seemed rigorous and strident at the time of trying to integrate the canon of American literature. What does that mean? Trying to get English departments to hire people like me who were specialists in African American literature. Allowing PhD students to write dissertations about Black writers. Making sure that a survey course on the American novel. When I was an undergraduate, the history of the American novel, one semester would include Richard Wright's Native Son. The next year, it would be Invisible Man. They were like a tag team in wrestling, They would say, y'all only gonna get one, and it's either gonna be Native Son or it's gonna be Invisible Man. Right. No self-respecting English department today in America would not have a specialist in African-American literature and would not have a course in African-American studies. The Norton Anthology, one of the things I'm proud of, one of the things I'm proudest of, I should say, is being one of the general editors of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. It took me 2 years to persuade W.W. Norton to do an anthology of African American literature, which came out in 1998. They were worried that they said that there wasn't a market large enough, and it's expensive to do one of those anthologies because of permissions. And I, honoring the tradition and its complexity, insisted that our anthology have a CD-ROM, remember those? Or a DVD in the back that contained all of the vernacular literature. So the spirituals are there, the blues are there, gospel music's there, Shine in the Titanic, The Signifying Monkey, oral folk tales, the first anthology in the whole world, I believe, that was published as a text with the oral tradition embedded in it that you could actually listen to. Now, of course, with the internet, it's on links. That was the cultural war that we were fighting. And I go back to those two examples because at this point, the presence of African-American literature and culture is embedded in every great research university in the United States. There may be 10 truly outstanding departments of African and African-American studies giving their own tenure and awarding PhDs. Nobody can take that away. That's here to stay. No one can take away the Norton Anthology. No one can change the structure of definitions of American literature to include heretofore submerged voices. But in the larger political arena, we have a right-wing reaction to the successes of the victories of the culture wars. And we have to be vigilant and we have to fight back. We have to do our work. We have to demand that diversity and excellence, and it's very important to say that, to pair those two terms, that diversity and excellence remain signal values of the American Academy. If there have been excesses in attempts to diversity, particularly in the wake of George Floyd, there was all kinds of reactions to the murder of George Floyd, some of them quite extreme on the left. And they have to be dialed back if we're not responsible and we're not, shall we say, within the bounds of that definition of diversity and excellence. We have to get rid of it. But you don't throw the baby out, with the bath. So that, we're used to fighting for the presence of African-American thought and culture in the academy from the 90s. Now we're fighting it in a different form here in the 21st century. I was a consultant along with Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham for the new AP curriculum. And you've seen oh my God, the rearguard reactions against that. I understand, though, I don't particularly like bad news, but I've been told that an essay or two of mine has been banned in Florida and in Texas. Okay, we have to fight we have to fight those rearguard actions, and the AP curriculum is alive and well and thriving and being taught in many schools. The AP curriculum in African American studies. That's another victory. The American publishing world has not dialed back like it did at the end of the Harlem Renaissance. One of the things that killed it is that white publishers were not publishing Black books. Publishers are still hungry to publish books by Black authors. So we have to demand responsibility among our scholars and teachers, right? We have to, I'll give you an example. Many Black scholars have been resistant about talking about the African role in the slave trade. One historian told me recently that 99%, I don't know if this is true, but it's mind-blowing, that 99% of the Africans who ended up on the ships that brought our enslaved ancestors to the New World were captured by other African elites and merchants, not by white people at all, and sold to white traders along the coast. Well, this is very embarrassing to Black people. It's very uncomfortable, but it's the truth. we have to tell the truth. We have to talk about the necessity of taking responsibility for our own actions. The causes of poverty, everybody knows, are both structural and behavioral. We have to address the structural causes of poverty, the legacies of Jim Crow, white supremacist racism. Of course, there are real factors that have affected the structure of the socioeconomic structure of the African-American community. But there are also bad choices that Black people make. And we have to be honest about that. We have to say deferred gratification is at the heart of the successes of the Black tradition. We have to learn how to defer gratification. Having babies out of wedlock is not a good idea. Having babies when you're a teenager, definitely not a good idea. Staying in school, definitely a good idea. Learning the ABCs, learning arithmetic. Look, I think our Sunday schools should have the equivalent function of Hebrew schools and other schools that hyphenated Americans have funded themselves. One of my most brilliant producers I've worked with, her name is Asako Glancho. Her children went to Japanese school on Saturday, like Hebrew school. We need the equivalent of Hebrew school embedded in Sunday schools so that our children learn about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and the birth of the spirituals and the blues and the history of gospel. We have to be responsible for the perpetuation of the knowledge about our own culture and not depend merely on the public school system.
Can I disappoint you, please? Which is that
yes.
I would not advise you to take the Hebrew school model as a model for the perpetuation of, especially, if we're talking about, Zora Neale Hurston, to go back to Zora Neale Hurston, a cultural conservative. We want these forms to be transmitted. Hebrew schools they've failed to do so. The American Jewish community is really one of the most illiterate diaspora communities in Jewish history. And it really is. So that, I think that sharpens the question, which is, this incredibly vital tradition, passing it on is not so easy.
Well, let me say that I'm no expert on Hebrew schools.
No, of course.
But for me, it's a metaphor. I've never attended one. But in my imagination, Hebrew school is where Jewish people learn the great history of the Jewish people, going back to Moses and Mount Sinai and getting the tablets. So I don't know. That's just my fantasy. So I stand corrected. But, I've attended several bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and it looks pretty good to me, having a child learn a passage and recite it in Hebrew. I think that's beautiful. All I'm saying is that different ethnic groups, different immigrant groups, different hyphenated American groups have formed their own modes of conveying their own culture, whatever form that might take. We need to do the same thing. And we have a structure in place that can do that. It's called Sunday school. And that's what I want us. I don't want us to be merely dependent on some school board in Texas deciding that Albert Murray is some kind of a quasi-communist or something, I want Albert Murray to be taught to Black
Sunday
kids.
School. All right.
And Sunday school, yeah. But also I want them to be taught in high school through the AP curriculum and in college if they choose to take an African-American studies course. But back to the difference between Africans and African-Americans. It really is a dramatic thing when you land in Africa and everybody's Black, okay? And you have, it's a very disturbing reaction because you know that you're experiencing something that you can't name and you don't even know why. And then all of a sudden you go, everybody's Black. The policemen are Black. The pilot on the airplane was Black. The flight attendants were Black. The doctors are black. The nurses are black. The traffic cops are black. The chauffeurs are black, and the people in the back of the car are black. Everybody is black. But then you realize as you get to know people, as I did when I was reciting the anecdote of Soyinka and Anthony Appiah, yes, we're black, but we're black with a difference. I'll never be a Nigerian. I'll never be a Yoruba like Soyinka. And I have Yoruba DNA heritage. I'll never be an Akan or an Asante like Anthony Appiah, no matter how hard I try. And I don't want to be. I am proud to be an African American. This is just one of the many manifestations of blackness throughout the world. Black people in Brazil. I made a documentary called Black in Latin America, where I met my wife, who's Cuban. And I've studied Afro-Latin American cultures that manifested itself in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and Peru. Many people don't even know that there's a long tradition of African culture and experience in both Mexico and Peru because of the slave trade.
Have you ever studied Ethiopian Jewry?
I have made 2 major documentaries, one in 1998 called Wonders of the African World, and one, I think, in 2016, you have to fact check me, called Africa's Great Civilizations. And in both, I filmed extensively in Ethiopia. And in one, I filmed a village that was still being, it had just been removed of Ethiopian Jewry in Operation Moses, as it was called, to Israel. And so, yes, and there are various 2 or 3 African communities that claim Jewish ancestry. And Tudor Parfit, the great English scholar, did DNA analysis of one in Southern Africa and said, yes, indeed, they did have Jewish genetic heritage.
The Lemba, right? I think.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And look at African Americans. I specifically and carefully said that we learned the English language and Christianity through the Hebrew Bible, meaning the Old Testament, as translated through the King James Bible. So, and the many metaphors that pepper the African American tradition have their roots in the Hebrew tradition. Like old Pharaoh, if a black person says that, we're talking about the white man. And Egypt was Egypt,
Professor Gates, so we really appreciate you joining us. I just have 2 questions. I'm going to ask them at the same time so you can riff. I'm going to start with the last question first. We always end with asking a variation of this question. What does being an Omni-American mean to you? But I do want, because let me just state this. You talked about that period in the 90s. In that very period of the culture wars, I had a cover story in the Village Voice called The Black Studies War.
That's right.
That featured you at Harvard and Molefe Asante at Temple as the 2 antagonists. I had a piece in Callaloo called The Canonization of Jazz and Afro-American Literature, where I did a comparative analysis of how jazz was canonized at Lincoln Center, and through the Norton Anthology of African American Literature that you mentioned, how you did it, So I'm well aware of that. But before then, and see, some people don't know that. That's why I want to mention this. You pioneered as a critical theorist the signifying monkey. You analyzed the work of Ellison, of several of the figures across Afro-American literary history. And you do it through both folklore and postmodern theory. Can you just summarize the theory from that 1988 work? Because some people don't, they know you through your work at PBS, but they don't know that foundational innovation of you as a critical theorist. And I think just to take a moment of that.
Well, Greg, when you published those articles, particularly the Village Voice piece. I don't want to exaggerate, but basically brought tears to my eyes because you were making available to a broad audience. It's like you peeped my whole card, as we say, peeped my whole card. You read my mind. I was astonished that you got it all right. That at least what I was trying to do. And you're right. First of all, my great antagonist, he was actually my friend, Malefi Asante. One time he wrote me and said, "I'm sorry I had to criticize you." I go, "Malefi, every time you criticize me, I get a raise at Harvard." The people at Harvard, they were so glad that Afrocentricity was not there. They didn't know what to do. But you know what? What I was doing was Afrocentric without all the mumbo jumbo, as it were, that Malefi. Let me put it politely, the superstructure that he was trying to impose, signifying, which is a fundamental term of the Black tradition. I thought it was important, as you pointed out, to find a term, a concept in the tradition to show that Black people had been theorizing about what they were doing themselves and that they had named it. And that was signifying, all right? And what is signifying? Signifying is take a text and you riff on it. You turn it inside out. You mock it. You laugh at it. You extend it. The relationship between Native Son and Ralph Ellison. Let's start with the title. Native Son, Invisible Man. Native, invisible. Son, man. Already you know that he's signifying. He's riffing. And then there are 1,001 other ways in that book that he, Ralph Ellison, takes central tropes from Native Son. I could give you another hour lecture on that, but I'm not.
I'd love to hear
it. And turns them on its head. And the most important is that Bigger doesn't tell his own story. His story is being told by a third-person omniscient narrator. By the end of Invisible Man, you realize that the author, as it were, is the protagonist who's in his soul typing the whole story that you have read. So that whereas one's in the third person, the other really is in the first person through a form called free and direct discourse. So what I tried to show was that that the real definition of tradition is like links in the chain, a signifying chain, that between Frederick Douglass and Zora Neale Hurston and Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray and Toni Morrison, there was a continuous chain of signification. And I tried to show that through close reading to say it's obvious that these people read each other, that Ellison was reading Wright, and they were all reading Frederick Douglass and James Weldon Johnson and riffing on them like jazz musicians do. And it was, I think, as you pointed out, it was one of the first attempts, if not the first attempt, to define a self-contained tradition through formal revision. And I'm very proud of that. And it's absolutely the case. And as I also pointed out, Ralph Ellison was riffing on Dostoevsky. He was riffing on Faulkner. I mentioned earlier Toni Morrison.
Hemingway.
Toni Morrison's master's thesis at Cornell was not about Richard Wright or Zora Neale Hurston. What was it about? It was about Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. Of course, they are placing themselves in the larger American and English and world, the canon of world literature. But the bottom line was that they were riffing on other Black texts. And that, you named that for me, and I could have kissed you. And which is why I'm doing this podcast. That, and because of our mutual affection for Greg Tate, whose loss is just unfathomable. Not enough people. He didn't have enough time. Not enough people have read him. I'm hoping that through your efforts, you can collect his work and canonize him. But I never had a chance to. And you were funny about it. You said something like, Yeah, Gates uses a lot of big words in here, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort. And you also said that there was serious business going on in the cultural work I was trying to do. I remember that. And you said that your readers should take it seriously, that the stakes were very high.
Thank you so much. Just about Greg Tate. I mean, we actually did a friendly debate at Harvard under your auspices. Thank you again for that. Where he took the position of Amiri Baraka. I took the position of Ralph Ellison because they were both primary influences on us becoming writers.
Right.
But we loved each other. So it was antagonistic cooperation, but more cooperation than antagonism.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel that way even about Asante, Molefi Asante. It was his story. It was his theory. And there's room for a multiplicity of theories about the Black experience, even Afrocentricity, which I fundamentally disagree with, but he fundamentally disagrees with me. That's all right. My lecture course at Harvard, which I have now, I think the book is in print. It's called The Black Box. It's due out any day. And it is composed of the lectures that I did for years in my introduction to African-American literature course, which I co-taught with Evelyn Higginbotham and Evelyn Hammonds and Lawrence Douglas Bobo over time. And you know how it's structured? It's structured around debates that Black people have had since the 18th century about what it means to be Black. And I want to show that there never was one way to be Black. Never.
Yes. Very Talmudic.
Yes. And anybody Black knows that we've been, all you do is go to a barbershop or a hairdresser.
That's right. That's right.
We've been
I was just at a barbershop the other day, and I just very quickly, and I walk in, and they are having a deep aesthetic and philosophical conversation about the merits and demerits of certain hip hop artists.
There you go.
Right in the barbershop.
Right in the barbershop. So the tradition continues. And I hope that other people will understand that one's interpretation can be richer and more nuanced if you take into account the Hegelian thesis and antithesis, like Du Bois did in his work, that all culture consists of thesis and antithesis. That's how there's progress.
And you get a synthesis and you get a counter statement, all of that.
Yeah.
No.
And it continues. As soon as you get a synthesis, there's an antithesis.
So what does being an Omni-American mean to you, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr.?
Oh, it means being a hyphenated African American. And it means a state of identity that is inescapable. That by Alain Locke, in an article about the relationship between African-American artists and African art, said by being modern, meaning following the modernist tradition, this essay was written in the 1930s, that if African-American artists imitated and riffed on the modernist tradition, they were being African, because the modernists had rooted the origins of modernism in African mask and African art. And we all know that Pablo Picasso in Les Damoiselles definitely was influenced by African mask. So that's a metaphor for being an Omni-American, that by being a Black American, I am an Omni-American. By being an American, I am being Black. It is, the two things are inextricably interconnected. It also means that you resist cultural bullies. That the last line in my lecture course is, if there are 47 million African Americans, that means there are 47 million ways to be Black. Don't ever let, I give this charge to my students, don't ever let anybody tell you that you're not Black enough or that there's one way to be Black. Because the whole point of this tradition and the whole point of my book, The Black Box, is to show the multiplicity of ways that we have celebrated and represented the state of being Black in the great United States of America.
Wonderful. We so thank you for joining us.
Thank you
Professor
very much.
Gates, thank you so much.
Brother Tepper, Brother Thomas, Godspeed.
Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American Podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.